Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Megzy, and today I will be doing my March reading wrap-up. I read a total of 8 books, which is quite a lot. So this is going to be a long video. Harley is prepared to listen to me yap quite a bit. About half of those books I read were feminist type of text, feminist history, feminist theory, because it was International Women's History Month. And I also read a decent amount of translations. So if any of that sounds interesting, please stick around and we will get started. The first book I finished in the month of March was The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan. I apologize if I am pronouncing her last name incorrectly. This is an overview of the current state of modern feminism, but it is more focused on sexual politics. There's about 6 essays in here that touch on topics ranging from incels, desirability politics, student-teacher relationships, pornography, consent, the Me Too movement, etc., etc. This book isn't really trying to argue any specific points. It's more of like a philosophical debate. And her writing, it's somewhat academic, it's pretty philosophical. She doesn't really arrive to any formative conclusions in most of these essays. She tends to play devil's advocate, and she argues both sides of an issue, and then she kind of ambiguously leaves it up to the reader to form their own opinion. So you might like that or you might hate that. At first, I didn't really mind it, but there were certain topics I just kind of wanted her to pick a side. The only essay where she very clearly expresses her opinion is the essay on sleeping with your students, where she obviously argues with the notion that student-teacher relationships that are sexual within the college world is inherently predatory and exploitative because of the power imbalance and just the very nature of the teaching relationship to the student in and of itself. But there were times, like I said, where I did kind of want more of like a firmer stance on her opinions. I did like that the way she analyzed feminism in its current state was pretty intersectional. She is a woman of color herself. For instance, in the context of the Me Too movement, which she does touch on in a couple essays, she mentions the slogan, "Believe all women," and she explores why this blanket term can be problematic in and of itself, not in the way that men's rights activists tend to talk about a conspiracy against men, which is literally the title of the essay, Conspiracy Against Men, but how historically, when we factor in race, as well as other systems of oppression like colonization, rape accusations by white women against black men in the US or against colonized people by the colonizer have been used to justify atrocities, lynchings, genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc. And so in the footnotes, I thought was really interesting, she also brings up a specific case in colonial India, I think it was India or like what is modern day Bangladesh, how like a group of men were accused of rape and then the British went on like this massacre. And just besides other examples, she mentions in passing like South Africa and modern Palestine. So there was a lot. I think this was a good text overall. It's like a really good jumping off point into deeper topics of within feminism. I mean, there's so much more that she touches on just very briefly, like sex work, carceral feminism, the ethics of porn, prison abolition. But I think overall it's like I said, a pretty good starting point. It's just that her writing is a little bit academic and heavy-handed at times and kind of philosophical, so it's not always the most accessible. I did have to sometimes slow down what I was reading, but I enjoyed it and I would rate it 4 stars. The next book I read was a book that was taken out of my library consistently for quite a while, and I finally got my hands on it. It is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. So this is not exactly a written work by Angela Davis. It is a collection of her speeches over the years, specifically in the 2010s, as well as 1 or 2 interviews that she gave. Basically, I think this book is like a good starting point for young leftists to notice how there are all these systems of oppressions that are linked throughout the world, specifically militarization and security apparatuses, or is it apparati? I don't know, and police brutality and brutality that happens in the global south that is funded by the US. She touches on, of course, like in the subtitle, in a lot of her speeches, she mentions the Black Lives Matter movement and its solidarity with the people of Palestine, specifically. And I do remember this when it happened, I think in 2014, the murder of Mike Brown, how Palestinians online within the West Bank and Gaza had actually reached out to African-American activists and said things like, shared their tips as to how to deal with like militarization and police brutality, like stand close to the police because they won't use tear gas on you because they'll end up gassing themselves. So essentially, it's, like I said, like a broad overview of how all of these systems are interlinked and how we need to take a more intersectional lens. The thing I did like about, two things that stuck out to me with these speeches, I did like how she mentions that the way we teach history, we always focus on like select individuals like MLK or Rosa Parks, rather than looking at like the whole collective action that evolved within these movements. These are just mass groups of people that make up movements, not one or two individuals. And that's not really taught. And I think it's something that, particularly in the US, we need to understand organizing better. And then the other thing that she touches on is we need to move beyond just simply thinking about civil rights and fitting within this capitalist democracy. We need to move beyond broader calls for a transformation of society. So like moving away from commodification of healthcare and education and housing and the prison industrial complex to, so like economic liberation is linked up with our own civil rights, and it's all tied together. Of course, Angela Davis is a socialist, so of course that is what she believes. This is okay. I think maybe I expected a little more, and I like knew a lot of these topics beforehand. I probably would have been more interested or fascinated by it, wowed by it, if I had read it maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But yeah, it's like good for people who are like new to like more leftist thought, getting away from like liberalism to leftism. But I think I just wanted a little more. However, it did push me to actually read her written works. So I will get to a work by Angela Davis coming up later on in this video. The next book I read and finished in March was, this is hard to do with one hand, The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates' first and I think only fiction piece he's written. He's primarily a nonfiction writer. And so I did read The Message last year, which is his latest work. And I was also familiar with him. I'd read some of his earlier pieces in The Atlantic when he was a regular contributor. So I think I had pretty high hopes for this, even though I hadn't read his fiction before. And yeah, it was a little bit underwhelming. This is historical fiction. It takes place at the end of the antebellum era in Virginia. I guess the Civil War is going on. It's kind of alluded to, but then we don't really see or hear much of it. And we follow the life of Hiram. He is a biracial slave. His father is the white plantation owner, and his mother was sold off. And one day his father decides that Hiram should become the personal servant to his half-brother. Lucky him. And so he brings him into the house as a house slave. And one evening, Hiram is out with his brother. His brother picks up a sex worker, and they're driving along, and they cross a bridge over this stream. Not stream, it's a river. And a tragic accident happens. And Hiram's brother dies in this freak accident, and Hiram lives, and he is able to escape using this special kind of power he has, that he has the ability to sort of teleport, that he had no idea he had the ability to use, and because he has the unknown power, he eventually decides that he wants to escape and slowly make his way north and join the Underground Railroad. So this book's premise sounds really interesting, but despite that, it actually got a little boring at times. I feel like there was about like 100 pages that could have been cut. I think this is like over 400 pages. It's somewhere around like the like 2/3 mark. That's where it started to drag. Other than Hiram, I feel like a lot of the characters weren't really fleshed out as much as I wanted them to. There was a lot of minor characters that were part of the Underground Railroad, the resistance that I started to mix up. Hiram has a love interest, Sophia, but I felt like that relationship and her in and of itself, like she wasn't really explored too much or fleshed out, I think, in the way I wanted her to be. And there was a couple like minor plot lines that seemed totally disregarded. So for instance, when the freak accident happens, like I said, his brother picks up this sex worker and we never hear from her again. And we don't know if she got out of the carriage, if she drowned. She's not mentioned at all. And I was wondering, I was like, why didn't his editor should have caught that for some kind of consistency? And then the last thing, the magical realism aspect. I don't know if that really worked for me. Hiram has this ability to teleport himself, and it's thought of something that was like passed along down by his ancestors. So it's this ancestral power, and very few people have it. And Harriet Tubman, who is featured as somewhat of a minor character in this novel, she also has that secret power. And I don't know if this works because I feel like it kind of takes away from the actual adversity that slaves experienced and Black abolitionists. Like, they didn't have magic powers. Harriet Tubman didn't have magic powers, and yet she was still able to do what she did. She was still able to bring so many people to freedom, and so I think that's why like the magical realism aspect didn't quite work for me. So overall, I think the book is informative, and it does offer like a pretty good portrait of slave life and the horrors of slavery and the horrors of like trying to escape and all that you were up against, and slave catchers and people just like constantly out to get you and just living like the most miserable possible life of horrors you can imagine. But I don't know, I felt like the book was a little underwhelming at times, and I just don't think that it captivated me as much as it should. So I thought it was just average. I would rate it 3 stars. The next book I read was called Trash by Sylvia Aguilar-Zéleny, translated from Spanish by J.D. Pluecker. This was originally published in Mexico. This is a story of 3 different women who are living in or on the borderlands of Juarez, Mexico, and southern Texas, and how their lives are connected to this trash dump in Juarez. So each chapter alternates from every woman's point of view. So we follow a teenage girl named Alicia, who is abused by her stepfather and later abandoned by her adoptive mother, and she comes to run away and live in this trash dump. And then we follow this scientist named Griselda, I guess for short, who is studying the dump and the people who live there for research purposes. And she's trying to see how these homeless people live and how they're able to reuse and restore other people's waste. And the third person we follow is this transgender sex worker named Reina, who's been in the sex trade for years. All of Reina's chapters are told in dialogue to these new sex workers that she is recruiting and helping them on board, showing them the ropes. She's like the mother hen. And so as the story unfolds, we see how all of these women are interconnected to each other in more ways than one. I really liked this a lot, actually. I thought it was pretty unique. I've never really read any kind of plot like this before. I thought the author did a really good job with the voices, because sometimes when you alternate different people's voices in like chapter to chapter, it sounds all the same, and I felt like each of the women in this story had like a pretty unique voice. And I thought One of the stories that was the most compelling was Griselda, the scientist, because while she's studying the stump, she also has going on in her home life. She's living with her older aunt, and her older aunt is struggling with dementia. And so I think the book did a really good job of portraying the agony of watching a loved one slowly lose their mind. There's a homemaid that helps out, and she tells Gris and her sister that their aunt is time traveling, and that sometimes when her aunt gets confused and starts thinking that Gris is someone else or her mother, the ade's like, well, you just have to time travel with them rather than correcting them. And I liked that. I thought it was good writing. The novel, it's short. It's not, I guess maybe 230 pages. And I really felt that the author, she's able to really convey and touch upon so many aspects of society that we don't like to think about, like the marginalized and the homeless and the trans sex workers, the elderly with dementia, the teen runaways. And so all of these people, by society standards, they are literally trash. And that's what this book is about. It's about literal trash in the dump at Juarez, and figuratively, the most marginalized, forgotten of society, how society treats these people. Alicia, I think, touches on how when she's living in the dump, over the years, these certain political figures have come and taken photos with the people and used them as part of their political campaign, how they're going to clean the place up, just using them as props. I like this a lot. I honestly wish that the author had more translations into English, because she's written a couple books, but I think this is the only one that was translated. And I think it's a really good, accurate portrayal of what life is like for women who live on the street. And there is sort of this undertone of simmering violence in the background, specifically for a woman who's living in the city that's not the safest. And so I think that this novel captured it really well without saying it directly. I would rate this 4.5 stars. The only thing I was a little confused was when Reina I thought she was talking, at first for the longest time, I thought she was talking to the same woman, but every chapter with her, she's talking to a new woman. And that was the only thing I got kind of confused on. But yeah, overall, I did enjoy this. The next book I finished was Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, which was translated from Arabic by Elisabeth Jaquette. This is a novella, and this broke me. This was one of those books that is so short, and yet it says and emotes so much in such a concise amount of text. I wish I could generate this kind of reaction to readers in terms of my writing, because it's simplistic, it's concise, and yet it's so powerful. So this is a novella. It's only about 100 pages, and it's broken up into 2 different parts. The first half takes place in Israel in 1949, which is 1 year after the Nakba. And we follow this group of Israeli soldiers who are patrolling an area in southern Israel, the Negev. I think that's how you say it. And they need to make sure that there aren't any Arabs who are trespassing and trying to come over into this newly conquered area. And as a historical aside, if you know anything about the years 1949 to 1967 in Israel and Palestine, there wasn't an official occupation, but there was martial law. So for Palestinians who remained within Israel and who were also on the outskirts. And so in southern Israel, there evolved close to Gaza. They cropped up these settlements and kibbutzes that they became these border towns, and they were kind of almost watching patrols to make sure any Arabs weren't trespassing from Gaza into Israel proper. And so we follow this Israeli soldier as he's patrolling and he's going about his job in this very standard, monotonous sort of way. We can tell he's not native, really, because he seems really uncomfortable with the atmosphere and the location. It's hot, it's dry, he's, on edge. He's bit by a spider when we get into that whole graphic detail about this spider bite that becomes an infection. And on patrol, he and his group come across a group of Bedouins, nomadic Arabs, and they kill all of the men. And there is one Bedouin girl who is there, and they capture her along with her dog. And they take her back to the camp, they cut her hair, and they rub gasoline on her and the dog as a means of disinfecting them. And you can guess where this is happening. A group of soldiers capture a young woman. We know what is going to happen. The scene, though, is pretty well done because she doesn't get graphic. It's like spaced out, and it's sort of like told in pieces, and we see this slow buildup. And so thankfully this girl's gang rape is not gone into explicit detail. And I think that is actually what is more powerful. And I think the thing that was really disturbing and heartbreaking was her dog, and how her dog is reacting while this is happening. And like, she's locked away in this hut and the dog is upset and howling. And that just like, that honestly broke me, because the bond that people have, particularly with dogs, is so strong. And like, they know when we're upset, when we're under distress. And that was really heartbreaking to read. And so they kill her and they bury her in the desert. And then we get into the second half of the novella, which follows a young woman who reads about this story. She is Palestinian, and she was born 25 years on the day this murder happened, and she becomes obsessed with it. And so she goes on this quest to find out more information. And that is the rest of the novella. And so I think what this novella does really well is that it really plays well with the past, and portraying how the past informs the present and how it's still always with us. And there were times that almost did feel like we were going to almost go into this magical realism route, but we didn't. At one point, the character, she goes to this hotel, which is not that far from the location of the murder, and she's outside laying down, and she senses this dog approaching her, and she gets up, and then she realizes it's just her imagination. And it's like almost this mystical moment where you wonder if there's like this subtle time traveling dimension, if it was the girl's dog. And then this main character, she's never named, she pumps gas in her car, and she ends up smelling like gasoline herself, which is what the young Bedouin girl smelled like. And it parallels, we see this parallel between these situations in a way that's really well written and really subtly crafted. And yeah, like I said, the novella, it really packs a punch, and it says so much in a short, limited way. Some people have said they thought that the main character was written on the back, slightly neurotypical, and I didn't really see that. I just thought that because she's like obsessed with like minute details, and yet she oftentimes doesn't always like see like the bigger picture, or she has difficulty doing like everyday tasks. And I just sort of thought her mind was fragmented from living under constant occupation and trauma. And I thought that was really how she was written. And I read this and I felt it was upsetting. It was beautiful. And I also felt angry. And I felt angry at just this gender-based violence against Palestinian women by the Israeli state that is just like, this deafening silence from Western feminists. And that to me was just so enraging, because it still to this day, it's never talked about at all. And the main character even states in the book how this story in and of itself, the rape and murder, was not all unique, that it happens almost every day. It was a regular occurrence. But the only reason why she was drawn to this particular story was because it occurred on her birthday, 25 years to the day. So yeah, I would rate this 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. It's heartbreaking and beautiful, and pretty much what I want when I read a book. The next book I read was Separate and Dominate: Feminism and Racism After the War on Terror by Christine Delphy, translated from French by David Broder. So So this was originally published in France in 2008, and the English language version came out in 2015. It was originally published under the title Classe dominée, qui sont les autres? I still remember my French accent. And I got this actually from the publisher because it is an indie press, Verso Books. They publish a lot of like leftist, left-wing type of writing literature. And my library did not have it. So this is a feminist analysis about the racial politics of France, specifically focusing on the treatment and discrimination of Arabs within France. There's about 10 essays in this book, and the overarching premise of these essays is how Western feminism has been used, specifically in France, to justify racist and xenophobic measures, such as the anti-hijab laws, when it's really just another form of bigotry and racism, but it's done under the guise of this sort of feminist, savior complex. And Delphy examines the racist dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims within France, which dates back actually to the colonial times, but then was really rebooted during 9/11, which we all know happened throughout the West, not just in France. There's a couple essays where she goes into the Afghan war and disputes this ridiculous idea that the West went to war in Afghanistan to save Afghan women from the Taliban, when in reality the war, like all wars, disproportionately harmed women and girls. And this idea that she also argues against this idea that we will save and liberate Muslim women by banning the veil without taking into account these women's own agency and why they even choose to veil in the first place. I know Mona Eltahawy in her book Headscarves and Hymens, she mentions that for some women it's not because they're doing it because they feel pressure or because it is because of purity culture. It's actually more of like a political statement. And so this idea of like wanting to be visible when you're part of a racialized group that is actively discriminated against and being proud of that is one reason why some women choose to veil. And both Delphy and Eltahawy actually touch on that. And she also refutes the idea that like French women don't experience any kind of sexism or misogyny, because some French politicians have apparently said such a thing. And I personally didn't know this. She mentions that in France, women did not get the right to vote until 1945. And this book was really eye-opening for me because there's honestly a lot I didn't know about France, and it actually helped to fill in some gaps when I traveled there when I was a senior in high school for a class trip in like 2006. Because she touches on what are called the suburbs of France, the banlieue. I'm going to have to. Banlieue. Sorry, I can't even say that word. And how it is within these suburbs, they're not suburbs in the way we think of as in America, but this is actually where the discriminated against racialized minorities who are also very poor tend to live. It's sort of like the projects. So instead of the projects being in the inner city in France, they are on the outskirts of the city. And that filled in a lot of gaps for me because when I went to France, there were riots about 6 months prior in 2005, and she actually mentions them. There was rioting that happened for about 3 weeks. And so that actually did fill in some gaps. I was like, okay, that's what is meant by the suburbs. So overall, this book deals a lot with like themes of respectability politics and intersectionality, and within feminism, this sort of like white savior paternalism. Her writing is pretty academically dense. The first essay, she talks about othering language and who has the ability to other people, and it's always like the dominant group. And a lot of the writing was very philosophical, and it took me a bit in that particular essay anyway to get through it. But I think this is pretty solid. I really tabbed the hell out of it. I actually want to read a couple things that I tabbed, because one of the things she also argues against is this idea of secularism within France. It's called there's a specific word, laïcité. And laïcité has been used, besides feminism, has been used to justify these anti-hijab bans and these burkini bans. And she argues that being secular does not equal being an atheist. You still have the right to practice your faith. It simply means that state and religion are separated, and these Muslim immigrants who are so discriminated against and downtrodden don't seek to, like, they don't have the power to overthrow the French government and instate Sharia law, like all of these ridiculous fears. And so she argues, what she says is that these extremists, laïcards, people who follow laïcité, never protest the fact that the state pays for the upkeep of 36,000 churches along with other official marks of indulgence for the Christian faith, nor are very many seen rising up against the fact that political secularism is not applied in 5 départements of France, where priests, pastors, and rabbis are paid by the state just as they were under Napoleon. Yet, at the same time they want to make the state school a sanctuary, they never mention that in almost half of all French children and teenagers are educated in religious-run, mostly Catholic schools. I also like how she touches on respectability politics. I feel this is really relevant to a lot of conversations that are going on right now in America with, like, the liberal left. And she says, as a feminist, I know that the revolt of the dominated rarely takes the form that would best please the dominant. I could even say it never takes the form that suits them. Let's go further. What the dominant want is for us to politely ask for our rights. And even if after 40 years of waiting, we don't get what we wanted, we ought to act like it doesn't matter. And it is indeed true that it's no problem for men if male violence against women is eradicated tomorrow or in 100 years' time. And it's no problem for whites if racism is eradicated tomorrow or in 100 years' time. Conversely, the dominant do see a problem in the oppressed reacting the wrong way. That's what we urgently need to correct, repress, and stamp out. The political class tells us, with a touching spirit of unity, that they have identified the cause of the problem. But first, they're going to attack its consequence, your unseemly reaction, and they'll leave addressing its causes for another day. That is, never. It's pretty good. I think a lot of people need to hear that. I mean, there's like a lot of really good analysis of colonialism and all that stuff, so I do recommend this. It's just a little bit academically dense at times, but yeah, she's pretty cool. The next book I read was Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. So, what is there to say about this book? This is a classic feminist text that is still extremely relevant to this day, despite being published in 1981. This came out in between the second and third waves of feminism, and she provides, Angela Davis, really a much needed analysis of Black women in America and how they were always on the front lines for the struggle for feminism and civil rights, dating back honestly to slavery. And so there's just so much history crammed into this book that is communicated so accessibly and is so concise. So the initial chapters, actually much of the book, she does focus on she starts analyzing feminism within America. She focuses more on first wave feminism rather than second wave because of probably when the book was published. So in the initial chapters, she talks about how a lot of abolitionists, both white and Black, were very foundational to the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement actually kind of evolved alongside the abolitionist movement. And I don't think I myself really realized that until I read this book. And so it really tramples on this idea that, like, feminism was this thing in America that was created by white middle class women and that Black women just, like, later joined in because they were always active participants, right? And so we see later on how Black women become sidelined in the feminist movement, and the suffragettes were very much focused on getting the vote, and they wanted to make their case more mainstream and palatable. And so to do that, they began to pander to the South. And in doing so, they alienated and sidelined Black women. And a lot of suffragettes became really enraged when Black men got the right to vote over white women. And so that is when you begin to see this creeping white supremacy within the first wave feminist movement. And you have someone like Susan B. Anthony, who did privately say that she supported Black liberation. After the Emancipation Act, Black people still suffered. I mean, Angela Davis goes into like all of the jobs that were available to them, and it was terrible. It was almost like slavery in a sense. Hadn't really even been eradicated because they were still doing the same kinds of jobs. And there was actively the threat of all of these lynchings that were happening. And so Susan B. Anthony kind of like, she cared about it, but not really. And she was like, let's tone that stuff down. We don't want to talk too much on lynching because we want to make our message more mainstream and accessible to everyone. We might alienate some white people, particularly white women that don't really care or are actually threatened by Black men. And she just sort of felt like anti-lynching measures that Black women were on the front lines fighting for was not really relevant to the women's rights movement because she did not understand the concept of intersectionality. And this kind of thing is just still so relevant to today. You could substitute any kind of like political struggle with like how sometimes like mainstream politicians to other movements don't see how these things are all interconnected. There is a chapter on communist women in America, both white and Black, and Davis touches a lot on like women's labor. That's an overarching theme because, like I mentioned, she's a socialist, she's a Marxist. Angela Davis was a member of the Communist Party as well as the Black Panther Party. She's a pretty revolutionary icon of the mid-20th century. I just think this is so fascinating because it's just a side of feminist history that is overlooked. I feel like we focus on the suffragettes and then we get to like Betty Friedan and the stay-at-home housewife, and a lot of women, most women, were always working. They were working in the factories. They were working as domestic help. She touches on like women, even like Black women before, during and after slavery were doing manual labor still, like not just domestic duties, but manual labor, like working in the mines. And so these ideas of like the stay-at-home mother, this Victorian ideal, and later this like post-World War II ideal, that just didn't really apply to most women because of their class or race and class or both. And so, like I said, she does, there's more limited criticism of the second wave feminist movement because, like I said, this came out in the early 80s, so kind of like in between waves. But she does touch on some of the racism that was prevalent among second wave feminists like Susan Brownmiller, her book Against Our Will, which really kind of frames Black men as rapists, or Black men more likely to rape. And Angela Davis also touches on the abortion rights movement. Now, this is about 8 years. This book came out after Roe v. Wade. And she mentions why Black and brown women weren't really so much on the front lines for abortion rights, because while they obviously wanted abortion rights, when we talk about reproductive justice for Black and brown women, there's a lot more to that. A lot of Black women were sterilized throughout the 21st century against their will. And of course, then we also get into like the racist aspects of the birth control movement, like Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist, because eugenics were very popular at that time. And I feel like that is something that is not really talked about, unfortunately. And it's something feminism really needs to address, because conservatives have talked about it for other nefarious reasons, but it's something that feminism really needs to come to terms with and to analyze and acknowledge past racism in order to just move forward. Because overall what this book does is it's a really good analysis of how race and class really needs to be factored in when we are talking about women's experience, because there is no single universal experience for women because of these different intersecting identities and systems of oppression. And so I think this text is wonderful. It's a really great introduction into understanding intersectionality, and it's also a really accessible book on women's history in the United States, specifically Black women and socialist women. So I really enjoyed this. This is 5 stars for me. And the last and final book I read in the month of March was Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi, translated by Jonathan Wright from Arabic. This was originally published in Iraq. And it won the International Prize for Arabic Literature, which is like the highest literary award you can win in the Arab literature. And it was also a Man Booker International Prize finalist. So with all of that hype, I had some pretty high expectations again, and this did not quite live up to them. This takes place during the Iraq War of the 2000s, and it follows a junk dealer named, well, he's one of the many characters we follow, a junk dealer named Hadi, and he creates this Frankenstein-like monster that is stitched together from the body parts of dead people from the war. And his goal is for the government to recognize the parts as people and give them a proper burial. And so that sounds really fascinating. I was like, ooh, sign me up. But there is a bunch of different people we follow in this book. There's a journalist at this magazine in Baghdad called Mahmoud al-Saadawi. I don't know if this was like a self-insertion of the author. And we follow like his story. He begins reporting on the monster, which throughout the book is known as What's Its Name, which I thought was a really clunky translation. It didn't quite work. There's also this man we follow called Brigadier Majid. He's working with the Americans at this fictionalized tracking and pursuit department, and they employ this team of mystics and astrologers to predict and understand upcoming events and sectarian violence. And then they become obsessed with tracking down the monster. And then there's Elisabeth. She's this elderly Assyrian Christian woman, a widow who she believes her deceased son Daniel will return to her. And so we follow all 4 of these people, not so much the monster. And I felt like this book had so many of like the right ingredients and potential, but it didn't really work for me. I thought the tone would be different. I thought it would have more of this somber gothic feeling, kind of like the original Frankenstein. And it's not to say like the world these characters are inhabiting isn't dark. I mean, it's Iraq in the 2000s. So of course it is. Like, we hear and see stories of car explosions and suicide bombers and all these like sectarian violence and gangs. And then, of course, it's alluded to, we see in one scene like the Americans' torture and detention of random Iraqi civilians. So yeah, all of that is covered. But like I said, I think the writing somehow is like a little bit commercial to me. And the tone is, I think it's trying to be darkly funny, and it didn't quite work for me. I was expecting something a little more bleak, like Minor Detail. I mean, even more of like the somber quality of The Water Dancer. I felt like that had a better tone for its subject matter, right? So yeah, like I felt that there was a lot of potential. But I just wanted like more gothicness, more darkness, more time with the monster. The monster and Hadi, they like barely interact. And so that I think is a lot different than the original Frankenstein. So I think it is, the novel kind of needed to make up its mind. It's like, is it a darkly funny story about the mess that was the American invasion and occupation? Or is it this somber, modern gothic tale about the depravity of war and the countless lives that are lost? And I think it's more of the former, but I was hoping for more of the latter. So yeah, that ends my wrap up for March of 8 books. If you are still here, thank you. You are a champion. Please subscribe, like, and comment, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.